We have some guests from the US and the UK joining us next, and we have a panel to wrap up this plenary session this morning. And the panel session is going to involve 3 people joining us. And the first of them is just quite an incredible guest for us to have from the US. So Camille Stewart Gloster is the Deputy National Cyber Director for Technology and Ecosystem Security for the White House. Camille leads technology, supply chain, data security, and cyber workforce and education efforts for the Office of National Cyber Director. Camille is a cyber technology and national security, I'm sorry, we've messed up the chairs. Camille is a cyber technology and national security strategist and policy leader whose career has spanned the private, public, and non-profit sectors. She joined ONCD from Google, where she most recently served as Global Head of Product Security Strategy, and before that as Head of Security Policy and Election Integrity. So Camille, thank you very much for joining us. So our next guest is Mike Bracken, CBE. And Mike is a founding partner of Public Digital, and he's a global digital leader. He also has a very modest CV, and he's led many wholesale transformations of large institutions in the private and public sector. He helps organizations use digital to change the way they work and solve systemic market, societal, and macroeconomic challenges. And Mike is probably best known to you as the digital director who created the UK's GDS and digital strategy around open source maybe 10, 12 years ago, and we'll delve more into that in a moment. Sorry, can you do that outside? Sorry, do you mind, excuse me, if you're going to have a conversation, we do it outside, thank you. And our third guest is Salem Avan. Salem is also someone who's traveled from the US, but he's from my homeland. So Salem is a Director of Policy, Strategy and Governance for the Division of the ICT in the United Nations. And his department's goal is to enable the UN Secretariat to deliver effectively on its mandate through the secure, responsible and innovative use of data, information and technology. There's so much that Salem has done. I'm going to skip to this piece though. Prior to the work he does today with the UN, he led cybersecurity at the UN. And in previous positions, he was responsible for information technology for peace operations, the largest department at the UN. And he joined peacekeeping in 1994 during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia and served in various places, including Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iraq, Western Sahara, Sierra Leone, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and for the United Nations, as well as for organizations for security and cooperation in Europe, and then the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So I think you will agree with me that we have some quite incredible guests who've graced our first plenary sessions. I'm blown away by the fact these people were willing to come and talk to us. And I want to start thinking about the future of open source software and a joined up international response. I want to start by setting the international scene for our open source software. And Camille, if I may, I'm going to come to you. The White House has taken a leading role in open source software security from the executive order in May 2021. Now, frankly, that was the first piece of regulation I had seen that clearly understood open source software. Can you elaborate a bit, Camille, on how that came about, the goals of the order, please? Sure.
First, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation today. That executive order to improve the nation's cybersecurity posture came out after the SolarWinds event, right? That incident really underscored the fact that to improve the nation's cybersecurity, we needed to invest upstream in our supply chain and really understand the vulnerabilities that were inherent in the products that we were plugging into our infrastructure, and to understanding more intimately how our supply chains moved and where the vulnerabilities lied. The investments in that executive order were just the beginning, though. The White House convened a bunch of public and private stakeholders to have a conversation on open source software because we understood that the software is a key component in that supply chain. That conversation catalyzed a number of different initiatives, but the National Cyber Director, Director Chris Inglis, my boss, decided that we really needed to focus on understanding what the federal government could do to support the momentum that was happening in the open source community. So how do we understand what the role of the US federal government is in driving the industry, the ecosystem forward? So that open source software initiative pulled out a few things for us. We wanted to understand where the opportunities were. We wanted to understand where the federal government could uniquely support. So things like funding and how do we support all of the infrastructure providers that aggregate and distribute software. There are opportunities there for the federal government. But what really came out for us was that memory and safety was a key factor in security vulnerabilities. And while it is not a silver bullet, while it is not the only way that we are going to support the community, the Office of the National Cyber Director is really investing in driving down the use of memory unsafe languages. For large programs that use unsafe memory languages, migration to safe languages would drive down security vulnerabilities by up to 70%. That's a huge way to scale our impact, to be able to support the community. So we've pulled together a number of interagency partners, and we are working towards that end, in addition to supporting NIST as they do their work, as we support CISA as they promulgate things like software bill of materials, and NSA as they do their work. So we've really come together as a federal ecosystem to drive supporting the open source work, but also just supporting our infrastructure more broadly.
Thank you very much. And sort of picking up on that, I will say that Linda Cameron, who runs NCSC in the UK, was invited, but we invited her a little bit too late. It took time to get to her. And I know that she wanted to be part of this conversation for NCSC as well. And we will follow up with her afterwards because I think there's going to be some synergies there. Mike.
Hello.
The UK also took a world-leading approach just a little bit earlier, 10, 12, 15 years ago now. So back when you were at the Cabinet Office, can you fill us in a bit on how that came about and the background on that?
Thank you, and thanks for the invite today. It's like an ancient history lesson now. How did it come about? By necessity, really. I mean, you know, I think the Standish Group report, the Chaos report every year, I think in 2015 showed that IT programs or programs which were delivered via technology had a failure rate of 84%. It's quite modest, actually. And I think what we walked into in the UK at that time was systemic repeat failure of enterprise IT approaches, which had all manner of problems, of which security was one, cost was another, skill sets, outsourcing, risk. And our Parliament in 2011, nothing to do with me, had a report which described the supply chain for technology and government as an oligopoly, which is one stop short of a cartel. From memory, it had 80+% of contracts awarded to 7 or 8 vendors or organisations. That was the context in which you walked, frankly, using well understood, community supported, cheaper but not free technology, and in doing so bringing into the public realm hundreds of thousands of actors, whether they be developers, curators, maintainers, providers, whoever, just seemed like an obvious thing to do. And it wasn't particularly difficult because all we had to do is signal our intent and then demonstrate that intent in meaningful ways, and we found it was like pushing at an open door.
Yeah. Now, I've been around long enough that I remember it very well, and it was a major, major shift at the time. And Salem, you and I have worked together on UN projects in open source, and I know that open source is really at the heart of a lot of what the UN does, and you're very engaged with it. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the synergies that you see coming from the open source communities and open source.
Thanks, Amanda, and it's lovely to be here. So I think that when we think about synergies, and when I think about my perspective being at the UN, we kind of have this kind of expansive role, dealing with things like, peace and security, development, international law, human rights, and dealing with that globally across 193 member states. When we really think about synergies, I think that one of the things that strikes me, and it really kind of goes back to the whole ethos of the DNA of open source, is establishing a purpose, a common purpose, establishing something. It's very synergistic to be able to say that we fundamentally, collectively believe in a certain approach, whether it be related to the climate, whether it be related to peace and security or human rights, and to establish that baseline of things that we can kind of come together around. So I think that's been something that the UN in its role is really trying to leverage, in the context, and trying to, I guess, introduce the open source community, which may exist in a technology and software infrastructure and data space, to some of the larger kind of drivers that we have. And I think that one of the kind of major synergies we find as well is around diversity. We clearly see in an organization like the UN, when you have that diversity of opinion, when you have that diversity of experience and of need, that the idea of something like open source being engaged to really try and address that and to bring that diversity together has been really synergistic and important for us. And we found that as we talk to member states, talk to the private sector, talk to the public sector and academia, we're finding that there's an enormous amount of opportunity that comes out of that.
And if we shift to think about adoption and engagement, and I've just been talking quite a lot with Eric about adoption and how that rolls out. Camille, one of the things that, we've seen this unprecedented adoption, but sometimes we hear, or people like me say, that policymakers don't understand technology enough. And I wonder how much that's been part of the issue faced for open source software, and how the White House got ahead of the curve on that, and how you plan to maintain that, to stay ahead of the curve, both internationally and at home.
Yeah, I mean, there are policymakers that understand the technology, but it has been really important for the Biden administration to really invest in making sure that the folks that are leading on these efforts come from a variety of backgrounds, from industry, that they are not just policymakers, that they are technologists and engineers, and that coming together of expertise and lived experience and industry knowledge and moving through sectors has been integral in truly understanding what the impacts are of the choices that we are making as policymakers, and how we support the momentum that's happening externally in the private sector and in research, et cetera. And so that's been really, really key. And you'll see throughout the administration that focus on making sure the right mix of folks are coming into the agencies and departments throughout the executive branch. The Office of the National Cyber Director in particular, we've been very focused on that, right? We're focused on how do we evolve towards a digital ecosystem that is secure, resilient, and equitable. And to do that, we need to not only focus on stopping the bleeding of today, but think about those things in the context of the future. How do we build future resilience? And my division is really focused on how do we do that in the context of emerging technologies, but also how do we do that in the context of people? How do we invest in developing a cohort of cyber talent that is highly skilled, multidisciplinary, and diverse, such that they can meet the challenges of today and tomorrow? And we're really investing in that work through a workforce education and training strategy, but that focus on getting the right mix of people, the right level of understanding, coupled with the public-private partnership, has been the key pivot, I think, that's driving that collaboration.
So I didn't know that was going to be your answer, but we're clearly very aligned in our thinking. And Open UK works in 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. You are the community. We have a legal and policy group which respond to legislation, but the third thing we've also identified is skills and learning, and making sure that people are being taught the right skills. Now, Mike, you've already talked about ancient history, and Camille's talking about the future. So since you left the Cabinet Office, since the government changed, there seems to have been a big shift. And one of the reasons I got engaged with Open UK was that I was worried that things had gone very quiet, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't fall behind Europe. Do you think that world leading position is slipping, has slipped? Where do you think we're going?
In the UK?
Yeah.
We're not so bad.
Very quiet.
I think, I'm not going to answer your question because
I did share it in advance.
Public Digital, a consultancy, we work with governments and big institutions, UN, IMF, World Bank, and governments around the world. An old colleague of mine used to say, just because you think you're ahead, you're not winning. And don't think Europe's ahead, frankly. I think that the bigger and more interesting movements are coming from COVID response, coming from crisis, coming from small teams empowered in small to mid-sized countries by population, but who've managed to get over their internal hierarchical problems to deliver for users. COVID's been a big help with that. What we've seen in the last 18 months is, following COVID, a big rush of money and people, quite rightly, people who know what they're doing in more positions of power around the world in governments, whether that be security software, anything else in digital. So I don't think the impetus is with countries with a Whitehall model, put it that way. And I don't think it's all good, actually, because I think that there's a sort of central point of what we see in that one of the benefits of open source tooling, open source generally, is the ability to rapidly react using things that already exist and are well understood with communities that know how to do them. I think what I'm seeing is a rise of politicians and political actors who, in a way that they've done to those political spectrum that's outside of government, are now operating in government, where they're coming either with a single issue or a single policy they want to attend, and they've realised something quite simple, which with open software, with a small team of people, you can deliver at scale massive change without often having to deal with the whole machinery of government on which you're sitting. That is not overall a good thing. There will be some good things and some bad things come out of that trend. And I think that's one of the watchwords for the state of open, is that to what degree is the software and the communities behind them willing to play a part in some of that, sometimes without the overhead of government agencies. I think the other corollary to that is, on the other extreme, is that there are huge opportunities for the multilateral organisations, but at the end of the day, most of what they are doing, hugely distributed obviously, is, I think your IT department, your UNICC is still pretty much an enterprise play, so they don't really have open source communities at the core of their operations in meaningful ways, and that's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm just going to come to Salem now anyway, and I know the UN is doing a lot of work in this space, trying to build and increase its presence. I was going to ask you about emerging markets, because Mike has already talked about some of the smaller countries being interesting, but you might also want to comment on what Mike's just said.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that when you look at the kind of state of open source globally, you have this, just as in all things, you have this massive diversity. We still have 47 what we call least developed countries, and they're kind of administered by the longest acronym in the UN, which is the United Nations Special Representative for Least Developed, Landlocked, and Small Island Development States. In fact, it's so long that they couldn't even use each of the letters, so they just used the first letter of each par. But it goes to say that we still have 47 countries that really have challenges in basic development. So I think when we think about those countries being able to use just technology, let alone open source, there are still massive challenges and massive impediments to that. There are also huge opportunities. Huge desire, a huge amount of creativity, a huge amount of innovation in those countries. But what isn't there is there isn't always the legal frameworks, the policy frameworks, etc. And certainly, we talked a little bit about cyber security, or the whole idea of safeguards. The safeguards are there, so you have this movement towards digital, open source, and the previous panel talked about some of the risks associated with that. And then at the same time, you have these digitization, which improves certain things but introduces risks that can't really be managed or legislated for. So I think those are the kinds of difficulties we're finding. The UN as an organization of 193 member states will find it difficult to find consensus on anything digital. And it's very kind of easy to think about. There's really just two camps when it comes to all things digital. You've got one very prominent member state on one camp, and you've got a couple of very prominent member states in another camp, and they kind of coalesce around those. So when we really start thinking about trying to have the UN be in that kind of multilateral space, I think it really has to be regional. It has to be partnerships around specific projects, specific activities, specific ideals or or opportunities that we really want to try and achieve together, and it has to be groups of member states, and the UK is very important in that. Private sector, public sector, and academia. And if we can get to that space, then I think we can start building up the different tiers that we need to be able to use open source in a global way that's meaningful. And maybe from that, we can start building larger kind of impetus, larger coalition, larger kind of consensus across these areas.
Yeah, I agree. The shift now I'd like to make is to think about the role that open source plays in our national infrastructure. And Eric and I were just talking about, national infrastructure, national critical infrastructure. And Camille, to come back to you, we see open source with this, really critical, central role in our national infrastructure. And there are going to be a lot of important conversations to be had all over the world about the future of funding by international governments. Where does the White House see its role in this?
Yeah, the Office of the National Cyber Director in particular is focused on federal cohesion, that present and future resilience I talked about, aligning resources to aspirations. And those things I think are going to be key for how the White House mobilizes around this, right? We are going to focus on how do we support the ecosystem with the funding that's necessary, or developing those collaborations and partnerships to underscore that. We want to be informed by the community itself, right? From the moment this office was stood up, and one thing that I hope that you are seeing from the White House in general is that public-private partnerships have been really key. And not just the performative conversation, but really a collaboration on the issues, a comprehensive conversation that should lead to an understanding of where we have challenges and opportunities, where we need to grow, where we need to expand our reach. And so much of the work we do is informed up front by engaging with the community, but also a continued conversation, collaboration on how we evolve the implementation of the things that we've identified. So we look forward to engagements like this because they help continue to refine our understanding of the role that we can play, the opportunities, and the actual need for support, because not everything should be driven by government, right? How do we support a movement fostered through a community that really will drive us towards the change? And so we feel like our role in this is kind of getting that federal cohesion aligned, supporting the funding, supporting a look not only at what we need to do today, but how we apply that to future implementations of open source software. What does the next iteration look like? How are we applying it to Web3, to IoT, all of those things, the lessons that we're learning in this moment?
Salem, if I can come to you, the UN's role in all of this, where do you see that?
I think the UN's a really important convening entity. So the idea of being able to bring member states together, as well as private sector, public sector, is going to be important. I think that in legislative areas, I think we have a massive role there. I think that we do need to have one or two very strong partners to really start that process, because open source, for everybody in this room is, I think you've been dealing with it for decades potentially, but for many of the countries that we deal with, many of the member states, many of the challenges, it's really just a frontier. It's something that's new. There isn't the kind of understanding of how to adopt that or how to even enter into that area. So I think trying to bring that together, bring the necessary support elements together to help explain how that apparatus is built up. I think the UN has the ability to convene in that area and bring folks together in that. And I think that the other thing that's really important is when we think about open source and we think about the fact that we have open source software, data, and infrastructure, and that's all come into where we sit today, we have an enormous amount of open source. That open source all came from some sort of aspiration. I think you used that word. I think that one of the UN's key roles is to kind of help identify those global aspirations that we potentially could share. And I think that's really an important thing in kind of catalyzing action.
Yeah, Mike. So I know you want to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on something that we talked about before. So back in October, you spoke at our infrastructure event. And something I write about and talk about quite a lot is commercialization and business models around open source. And there was something you said, and you said there is a new business model for open source. And you talked about government and government funding as being that new business model. Now, I don't think it's a business model, but I think it's a necessity. Can you talk a bit more around that for us?
In a minute.
Mm-hmm. I know you want to come in, I know.
See, I listen to that, and that's all right, particularly the convening stuff. But I mean, we advise governments around the world, and I just sort of just want to reflect on something. So governments big institutions are great at rock collecting when you want to change something. That's great, but just go and collect a few rocks. We've got to be really careful with open source at the moment. Because it's beginning to sound a bit like, hey, you've done so much great stuff. You know, you've shown you can work on critical national infrastructure. You've shown you can deliver government, say, public services at a fraction of the cost. All the things that 10, 15 years ago said were impossible. But there's still a sort of, oh, but you know, you're probably inherently insecure, so it's up to you to go and collect some more rocks to demonstrate to us that you're insecure. Meanwhile, we'll continue running some really dreadful software that we've had for 25 years on our systems. And I think this movement's got to be a little more confidence to sort of face down the big institutions or face up to them and say, look, convening great, but we're not going to be judged by the same standards of whether it be security or just as an industry that the previous rent-seeking technology companies have carved up public sector to become. That's why I'm interested in Chi's comments earlier, because I just be really, really careful, because I think the opportunity is not to mimic standards that were set in the past, often unattainable for this movement, but actually to step into the imagination bit, which says this is what we could do. Now this is mature.
Well, what we create is de facto standards, right? Inevitably, that's what we do.
Correct. We're going to create them anyway. So I think that the business model, or not business model is a poor choice of words by me, but the sort of the commercial opportunity is this: is that if we see, I'm talking now particularly about the public realm, if we see much of what's delivered, take this country, much of what's delivered has been given over in previous decades to essentially rent-seeking contracts where either in part or in full services are delivered by technology companies, systems integrators and operators. And there is, you can argue all day about the economic value of that, the removal of risk. But at the end of the day, the government will carry the risk for those, because it always does. And yet there are vast parts of the public sector that don't even get addressed. So in this country, adult social care, there are probably 2.5 to 4 million people in that gap between mental health, social welfare and benefits. They're hard to address. And there are massive opportunities for this movement to focus not just public service delivery, because we've shown that we can do driving licenses at a fraction of the cost. That's fine. That's pretty sort of transactional. But focus on real policy direction and say, like, how can we help you deliver that to governments around the world? So, I'm one of these people who advise Macron and his tech thinkers, and trying for Europe to weave a path through the sort of US model with the tech bros and the platforms, and the sort of autocratic model on the other hand, and try to find a path that is uniquely European. This is not easy, right? And I certainly don't have the answers, but the point
when you say, sorry to interrupt you, but when you say uniquely European, I get frustrated because I get this stuff constantly about European values, digital sovereignty, but it's the same for everybody, right? It's not really uniquely European, it's uniquely nation state.
Well, no, I disagree with that.
Okay.
Because that's a good point, but I think what he's saying is, getting well off topic here, but is essentially nation state views of this are really of two types, where you have tech sovereignty, where you have enough tech in your system with the sort of to be able to operate, or not, or where you're actually buying it in, renting it and so on. And what he's saying is, I think what he's saying is, Europe, of course, geopolitically has scale, but actually because of the partition nature and the countries within it, the sovereign nature of the tech within individual countries adds up less than the sum of the parts. Yeah. And so how do you bring that to bear?
Okay.
But how do you bring it to bear with this sort of community behind it? By the way, that is a tricky one, so I don't know the answer to that. So I think the opportunity in front of us is to actually use open source much more as a guide path for how we deliver rapidly public policy outcomes. And I think COVID, we did a piece of work at Public Digital, but there's a straight line analysis between COVID response and where you have multidisciplinary teams, often using open source, certainly using open standards, to deliver In fact, go to Togo, you'll find out they've had 2 goes at it with SARS and MERS. They know how to do this stuff. Other countries, including ours, comparatively are at a standstill. And so there's a massive opportunity to very quickly deliver public policy outcomes. And I think that should be the focus. And having the economic value behind that, having more people employed doing that, more people participating, and actually the massive opportunity in this country is divesting what happened in the central government to local government, which has been a completely locked into 3 or 4 vendors for decades. And so these are huge opportunities. And I sort of, as a huge fan of the open source communities and movement, I just hope we don't get pulled back into justifying old models that other people couldn't attain to in other industries and have the freedom to approach that. Now, as someone who's run critical national infrastructure, I'm not sort of unaware of the importance of what's already been talked about here, but it's not an either or, it's an and.
No, I think it's a very good point. So I have no more written questions, and I just wanted to get us back on track for lunch. And what I'm going to do is just say to the panel, if you'd like to add some closing remarks, I'll let you choose who goes first, whoever's ready to jump in, if you've got any closing remarks you want to add to the conversation today.
I think we can reinvent government quite quickly in the next 3 to 5 years, and I think there's stuff happening around the world. In Portugal, their response to energy tariffs is worth looking at. It's in a distributed way. We can't see it yet as a pattern. But 20 years ago, there was a number of people more who could see open source emerging as a pattern. The idea of this conference would be beyond belief at that point. And I was one of those people. Yeah. I was an internet researcher before the web existed, because I'm very old. And, I could see it. I can see that now, that there is an opportunity to massively, at speed and at scale, invent a new policy arrangement around provision of services and around more equitable distribution of policy, and it's this movement that has to sit at the heart of it.
Any other remarks, or are we good?
I'd love to build off of Mike's comment. I mean, I completely agree with your yes and. I think we are in a moment where government is open to, and at least the US government is positioning itself to realize the benefits of creativity, of a variety of experiences and expertise coming to bear on this problem space. And the opportunity to learn from what we are dealing with today, to get ahead of what is to come, but in a way that is true to that problem space, to that challenge, to the societal and economic factors that will change the nature of the application or implementation. Those things are all very important. And this opportunity to really look across all of the national security, economic prosperity, and human rights implications of the moves that we are making today is something that we are really keened into and excited about the opportunity to partner on. And so I'm just heartened by the level of collaboration and engagement that I am seeing across sectors, and excited about that yes and.
Thank you. Salim, anything to close us with?
Yeah, no, I think, having spent quite a lot of time in all sorts of different places in states of post-conflict, in conflict, what kind of strikes me is that many of the things that we talk about aren't of concern to many of the member states in the world. There are much more pressing, much more visceral, much more basic concerns. I also think that we have to kind of really understand whether or not we're talking about open source as a mechanism for economic growth. And I hear the word consumer a lot. I don't like that word. I don't think that's a nice word. Or whether it's something that can be used to do something that's fundamental to what we as global citizens want and need, noting that many of the issues that we face as humanity are not contained within sovereign states. Mm-hmm. They're just not. Whether we talk about simple things like data or cybersecurity, or whether we talk about complex things like peace and security and human rights, they transcend all of that. So I think that it really just becomes a question of, when I think about open source, I think that there is a lot of kind of technical aspects of it relating to, the policy of it, the legalistic aspect of it, the technology of it. But there's also the fundamental core principle, or I guess the the aspirational element of open source. And I think that's something that we should really reconnect to. And it has the potential to kind of really inspire change and also collective effort. And I think that's really important. So I think that's just what I wanted to end with.
Thank you. I said at the beginning of all of this, I have an anniversary tomorrow, and it's 15 years tomorrow since I joined Canonical. And I thought I knew what open source was, and I could give you the lawyer's definition and nothing more. And to be honest, it's been a continuous growth, but it took me a good 6 months to even get my head around it. So I'm going to ask you to join with me in thanking this incredible panel, closing our plenaries.